setting up your meeting.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. It's Ilenia Ventroni again from YMCA Europe, from Brussels. As all of you, I hope, still in lockdown. So we're gonna talk today about a couple of things that probably were interesting for you, which is some European institutions like the EU and the Council of Europe. And as you can see from the presentation on the screen, I called it a small introduction into what scares you the most, because most people are quite scared of how the EU works, and most people say they don't know it or they can't understand it and it seems too complicated. See, it's not the end of the world. I won't tell you it's not complicated, because that would be a lie and I would lie to you. So we're just going to look on how they work, and we're going to keep it a bit closer to youth organizations. And so we'll understand how do youth organizations interact with the EU and the Council of Europe, and specifically how we do it in YMCA Europe, but how our fellow youth NGOs do it. And then we're just going to leave the floor to questions. Literally, any question you may have on the EU, and I'll try to answer as far as possible. You can shoot your answers on the comments on the Facebook Live, and there will be a little delay, something like 10 seconds, and then I'll be able to answer it to you. I'll try to do my best. My specialty, academically speaking, is the EU and EU institutions. And I've been working here in Brussels for 5 years now for YMCA Europe. I'm their advocacy officer. So in theory, I should know everything, but no human being can. So forgive me if I'm going to have to say, wait, I'm going to have to look up that thing. So with no further ado, because I don't want to keep you longer than 1 hour, let's go. Let's start from what's the EU? So the European Union is what we call an entity. That's because it is an international organization, and at the same time, it's something a little bit different. It's not like the UN. What we call the UN is generally a supranational, an international organization that works in a fairly egalitarian way between the countries. They retain all of their sovereignty. They just decide to work together on certain topics. The EU is based on the principle of competencies. So some competency of the state are actually taken away from the state and given to the EU. It is not a federation, because to be that way, probably there would be some policies that should belong to the EU and they don't. So if you look at the United States, there's also there a system of competencies. Some competencies are to the states and some competencies are to the federal government. The EU is not a federation because it's not integrated to that level. We say that the EU is based on treaties because it's the treaties that give the competencies to either the EU or the member states. So it's based on treaties, that's true, but it's also based on human rights treaties. So not only we're talking about the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU or the Treaty on the European Union, but the latest ones, what we call the Lisbon Treaty, is the latest one signed. But we're also talking about the Declaration on the European Charter of Human Rights that we all signed. And those are part of the fundamental values and the fundamental liberties that are part of the treaties as well. So the EU is based on these human rights treaties and on the treaties on the functioning of the EU that gives competencies to either the EU or the member states. So what is the difference? Why do we say that it's stronger than the UN? Because some rules are enacted directly. What does that mean? It means that it has been established by the main enforcer of the treaties in the EU, which is the Court of Justice, and by the jurisprudence of the member states, that EU law in some cases is higher than internal law. If internal law does not agree with EU law wins on certain topics, on certain competencies. For example, the internal market, and so for products and things like that. But you would be surprised once you agree that the EU has the full competencies of exchanging products and products standards, etc., then there are a lot of these rules that end up spilling over a lot of other topics, but we'll talk about it a bit later. So on the other hand, you have the Council of Europe. So the European Union has 27 member countries. Unfortunately, we lost the UK very recently to Brexit, and sounds like a disease, but there you go. Council of Europe is not an EU institution. It's not the EU. On one side you have the EU, on the other side you have the Council of Europe. Two different things. Why? The European Union has 27 member states. The Council of Europe has 47 member states. That means if you look at the Council of Europe, their membership is quite close to YMCA Europe, if you know what I mean. It's more the continental Europe membership. It is not an EU institution, and it has, in this case, it doesn't have competencies on economics like the EU or things like that, but its main goal is to defend human rights. It also works on education and youth. This is why it's very, very relevant for us. And it manages the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. Why? Because the Council of Europe is based on that Charter on Human Rights that it shares with the EU. So most, like all European Union member states have signed that charter, and they're also members of the Council of Europe. And the main enforcer of that Charter on Human Rights is the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. All right. So I know it's complicated to remember that, but you have to remember this main difference. European Union and Council of Europe are two different things. Although inside the EU, there are institutions that are called in a very similar way, and we'll try to make it as clear as possible. So in the European Union, these institutions, the European institutions we talk about, their main actors are the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the European Council. But remember, the European Council is not the Council of Europe, and the Council of Europe is not the EU, all right? In this case, we're going to talk about each singular institution. You might have heard about the European Commission, whose president now is Ursula von der Leyen, German, and the European Parliament, whose president now is David Sassoli, Italian. And now the European Council's president at the moment is Charles Michel, who's Belgian. So the European Union has one main actor that everybody knows, which is the European Commission. We call it a little bit the government, although it's not, it doesn't look at all like governments in your states. Its main job is to draft laws and to implement the approved laws through programs. What does that mean? You write the draft for a law, and then you pass it on to the other institutions to modify it and to approve it. And once it is approved, then the EU's job is to create programs, for example, to fund the application of this law or to really enforce it in case it is, though that law has not been respected. So how is the European Commission formed? Each member state of the EU nominates its candidate for one commissioner each. So let's say if you're Ireland, you nominate the person that you think is the best for the job, and you decide what I'd like, the portfolio my country would be, for example, agriculture. So I'll put forward this guy that I think is a good expert on agriculture, and I'll bring him forward as a commissioner for agriculture. Then what happens? The European Parliament analyzes these candidates. If the candidate is not adequate, if there are issues of corruptions or of incompetencies, let's say this guy is brought forward for agriculture and not once in their entire life have they touched any issues related with agriculture, that's a problem. Or if the person has shown to be against EU fundamental values, etc., the Parliament can reject that candidate and the state has to nominate a new one. It is a quite big power, and in case you're asking yourself, has this happened? The answer is yes, absolutely. There have been a couple of cases of rejection for corruption, and in the past it happened to a couple of candidates, a French one and a Bulgarian one, and many others, I think. Unfortunately, it's still a plague throughout Europe. And it happened also the instance of being against EU fundamental values. Buttiglione, a politician nominated by Italy, had expressed himself in a very derogatory way towards LGBTQ people, and the European Parliament rejected him in the job of commissioner it was being suggested for, because they said it is not acceptable that someone is not in line with the main principle of the EU, which is to avoid discrimination on any ground of sex, race, gender, or sexual preference, etc. So it has happened all the time. So the Parliament has this big power to reject commissioners and in the face of analyzing them. So each commissioner has a portfolio, as we mentioned. There's education, there's agriculture, there's youth. In case you're asking yourself who's the one that we care about at the moment, the one for youth is Maria Gabriel from Bulgaria. Absolutely pronouncing it bad. If there's any Bulgarian listening, I apologize in advance. But she's the commissioner that deals with most issues that we work with. Under each commissioner, like it was a minister, so you can think of this way as the commission a little bit like a bit of a council of ministers in your country. Each commissioner has a director general under them. So civil servants, a team of civil servants that does the work of the director general like a ministry. So right under the commissioner, you will have a director general who will lead the directorate general and all the team of civil servants inside. They will have the job of simply putting into practice the political direction given by the commissioner and implement programs, distribute funding, and evaluate funding proposals. Sometimes it's actually analyzed, as we've seen in the other webinar. It's actually, they manage the external experts that then do the evaluations, etc. So the European Commission works a little bit like a council of ministries, but it's much more civil servanty, if you will, than the ministries that we know in our own countries. And as we said, very important job is to draft laws. And we're going to see a little bit how decision-making works in the EU. So second of our important institutions, should be the first in terms of democratic importance, is the European Parliament. It is a directly elected body of the EU. It means you elect European Parliament members directly in your own country if you're in a member state of the EU. And we have 751 of members of the European Parliament. And the EU is divided in constituencies. So you, for example, I'll give you an example. In Italy, my region, the region where I was born, is Sardinia. And the one smack dab in the middle of the Mediterranean. Don't feel bad if you don't know what it is. Most people don't. So Sardinia votes for their MEPs together with Sicily, the other region, the one everybody knows. And so we vote together on our MEPs. So the most voted ones pass on to the European Parliament. So Sicily has 6 million people and Sardinia 1.5 million. So what happens sometimes is that you have less Sardinian MEPs than Sicilians. But whatever they are, whoever gets elected, they will have to take care of the whole constituency, so Sardinia and Sicily. So this happens in many other places. And many people find the constituency to be a bit arbitrary, but it really depends on the country. Sometimes you vote by state, so in places like Spain or Germany, or sometimes two states are put together. But, you know, it happens in different countries, different rules. And so you vote for them directly and you elect them. And then they, of course, they belong to national parties, but once they are inside the European Parliament, they will have to group in big European political parties and groups. So you have the two main ones are the EPP, the European Popular Party, which is basically Christian Democrats, more or less. The SD, which is basically the center-left. So you've got center-right, EPP, center-left, the SD, Socialists and Democrats. Then you have a group that made big gains in these elections, which is the Greens. Then you have the ECR, which is the conservative group. And then the EFD one is the one that changes the most, is what you would call a bit of the right end of the spectrum. And you've got Eurosceptics and you've got, you know, a bit of that area. Then you have the left, like GUE, so we're even communist parties gather, etc., etc. But let's say that the very two big ones, without which you can't really approve anything, are the EPP and the SD. Although none of them today has the total majority, so there have to be alliances at the moment. Then the MEPs, so each MEP belongs to a party, to a big party, and also MEPs are divided in committees. So according to their interest, they will be dealing with different issues. So what does it mean? It means a law that is voted upon by the European Parliament is voted first in a committee. So let's say I am an S&D MEP from Italy, so center-left, I'm in a center-left party in Italy, say PD. I end up in the S&D party in the European Parliament, and I really care about agriculture because I'm from Sardinia and agriculture is the main economic thing. So what I try to do is I try to get into the Agri Committee, which is the one where we're going to vote upon agricultural issues right off the bat. And if I am really good at, convincing the head of my S&D political party in the European Parliament, I can ask to be given a dossier so that I can manage the voting on my side on a specific topic, and I can become the rapporteur on a specific topic. So, for example, if there is a law on animal health, which is an important issue for Sardinia, let's say, then I can ask to be the rapporteur on the new law on animal health, which means I will be able to influence that law a lot because I will be able to call the shots on many things. For example, I will be coordinating the work of the European Parliament on that. When we're going to write amendments, I'm going to be able to guide that work in the sense that if amendments need to be all put together because they're quite similar or some of them are not legally admissible, etc., I'm going to be working on that. So it's quite important to be a rapporteur or to be in the right committee in the European Parliament. We're going to see more on the decision-making process. Then you have the committees, which are quite important. So there's the Committee on Agriculture. The committee that we care most about, of course, is the one called CULT, which is where we discuss issues about culture and youth and education. And this committee then decides on pieces of legislation for funding, for example, like Erasmus Plus, etc., etc. Then you have intergroups, which are basically interest groups. So let's say that you care about youth, then you are a member of an intergroup called the Youth Intergroup. So that means the moment that there is Erasmus Plus and say we want to double Erasmus Plus, you go with your fellow MEPs and you try to convince them to vote on that issue. Maybe that MEP doesn't care about youth, and when they vote on youth topics in the European Parliament, they're like basically pushing a button, don't care much about it. But you have a chance to take a coffee with them and say, please, this is so important for so many youth organizations, and you'll see even your constituencies are going to be very grateful if you vote for this, etc. So a youth intergroup is basically an interest group that tries to influence legislation, but it doesn't have the same powers of a committee, of course. So an issue that gets people really, really worked up is the fact that the European Parliament actually has two seats, one in Brussels, one in Strasbourg. In Brussels, there's all the sessions of the committees. Most of the work is done in Brussels. So when we vote laws inside the committee first, then we do it in Brussels. But then the plenary, so when everyone has to be present and you get the final vote, the important vote on laws, has to happen in Strasbourg. Of course, this is a massive challenge in terms of logistics. You need 751 people plus an average of 3 to 5 staff teams that need to all move to Strasbourg once a month for a couple of days. And to this day, logistics are quite crazy. I worked for a year in the European Parliament, and oftentimes if you didn't book your travel on time, you'd end up in alternative ways like carpooling or things like that, because sometimes there's just not enough trains and planes. Why? Well, it's because the European Union tries to keep institutions in a good number of countries so that not everything is concentrated in Brussels. I guess in a way of trying to keep people attached to the institutions and keep them present somewhere else. But the European Parliament itself has voted several times to get the seat only in Brussels. So This is the Parliament, and we're going to talk more later about the decision-making process, but this is important now to introduce the other very important actor, number 3, and some people might argue is the most important for how things are going politically speaking in the EU at the moment. It is the councils. Well, we call them the councils because it's like the Trinities, 1 and 3 at the same time. What does it mean? We have first of all, the European Council. This is where it's an EU institution, of course, and it gathers all the heads of state. They are in charge. They don't gather that much because they are in charge only of the big deals, like big treaties or policy changes. They give input for big developments. So let's say when the United Kingdom decided to get out of the European Union and started the process for Brexit, a big input that the European Council gave, since the UK, for example, was very opposed to extend social rights in Europe at a European level. One thing the European Council did was, well, let's start working on this. And that was what we call the Pillar of Social Rights, that is now in force and is expanding as we speak. And so the European Council is where the heads of state, so your president of the republic, if you have them, or whichever, they gather and they give big input for big changes just once in a while. But then you have the Council of the European Union. I know, whoever decided these very similar names, there should be a special place, and I wouldn't call it hell because they're nice people. In the end, they created something nice, but you know, they could have had a bit more fantasy with the names, a bit more creativity. Anyway, the Council of the European Union is the EU institutions that gathers ministers. So this institution has different formations according to topic. So let's say we're deciding on a law about agriculture. The council will be in charge of the specific law, will be the council made by all the ministers of agriculture. Same thing for education, same thing for migration, etc., etc. They work on what we call the ordinary legislative process, which is basically the one through which we decide around 90% of EU laws, which is the one that has the biggest power of the Parliament and representative institutions. The president of the Council of the European Union rotates every once in a while. I'm very sorry, these are old slides. It's not Romania and not Finland at this time around. So basically, you have a rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union. What does the presidency do? The presidency gives input to the legislative processes. So let's say that in the 6 months that you have, oh, I have a question here. Sorry, I have somebody. Aikui Karapetian, yeah, she's telling me, yes, as a council of, as a COA member, we're discouraged to travel to Strasbourg wherever there is a parliamentary session, since there are few flight options that are quite expensive and almost it's not a possibility to find accommodation. Absolutely true. When there is a session of the European Parliament in Strasbourg, it's crazy. So, at this very moment, the presidency of the Council of the European Union is held by Croatia. What does it mean? There are, at this very moment, some laws that are being discussed. So Croatia will have a lot of power on those laws that are discussed right now. So let's say if there is at this time a big discussion on Erasmus+, you really need to know as an NGO that the person to speak with right now is the Croatian presidency. So that means if you have a member in Croatia, this is where you want to tell them, oh, please get a hold of your government and talk to them about how, you know, youth organizations would need more funding, Erasmus+, yada, yada. So it's important to know who's in charge at every given stage. It's tough because they change every 6 months. And if you want to know why, it's an issue of representation. Many countries care about different topics, but it's such an important role to coordinate the work of the Council of the European Union on specific topics that it's fair that countries get this presidency once in a while. And it's a great opportunity to show off your country and to bring the EU closer to your country for that time in a while. There's a lot of events organized for presidencies. So it's also a good way to get in touch with different citizens of the European Union a bit closer for every 6 months. So let's talk about the decision-making process, because you've heard about these institutions. So what do they do? What's exactly, practically, what do they do? The Commission drafts a new law, right? The Parliament and the Council amend it with the ordinary legislative procedure that we talked about. They have the same power. And then once that law is approved by the Parliament and the Council in the same text, it is law. And it is implemented everywhere in Europe. There are different types of laws. I'm not going too deep into this because otherwise it becomes an academic lesson and you're gonna fall asleep, and already times are tough. You don't need to be bored to death by me, but there are regulations and there are directives. Regulations are the strongest ones. They're stronger than the law in your country. They need to be implemented exactly as they're written. Otherwise, any citizen whose rights are breached by the fact that this regulation has not been implemented in their countries, they can go to the Court of Justice and sue their own country. This has happened countless times. As an Italian, hello, this has happened many, many times. There's a famous case we all study in college about this, the Simmental case. Basically, for example, EU law gives you the right to export a certain product with the same rules as as your own country, etc., and say your country does not allow to do that, then you can bring say Italy in front of the Court of the Court of Justice, and the court will administer a fine, a hefty fine, which no one wants to have. And Italy is still paying fines to this day, but many countries are allowed to pay fines for that. And these laws, though, are quite reasonable, and countries and people have quite a possibility to influence them. So it doesn't happen that often then they're not implemented. Then you have directives. Directives basically give you a goal to reach, but then how do you reach it? With what type of law and with what wording is a bit more left to countries. Historically speaking, you will see the newest directives are actually a little bit more detailed and bit more, binding in what you can and you cannot do than older ones. So I'll give you an example of those laws that mostly have regulations on them: environment, agriculture, competition, etc. On youth policy, you would have less of that because youth policy is not a direct competency of the EU. There is a difference between direct competencies, as we've talked before about. These competencies are quite different. Some competencies reside all with the EU, some are shared with EU and member states, and some others really only belong to member states, but the EU can give directions on it, and youth policy and education is one of those. However, it's a tricky one because especially education influences some of those topics where the EU has the monopoly of competency. For example, the fact that you get a degree in your country is quite an important topic if you then have the freedom to move, which is the 4 freedoms are quite important in the EU. The freedom to move people, capitals, and the freedom to move merchandise, and the freedom of recognition of your academic titles is fundamental to this, of course. If you have the freedom to establish, say, you're a doctor in Italy, then you can be a doctor in Spain, let's say. Spain cannot say, oh, no, you can't, because you have to have done exactly what our Spanish people have done to become a doctor. What they can do is saying, you have to pass a certain test so that we're sure. But any barrier in theory should not stand. So some topics, as you may say, the tendency in the EU is that once you establish a competency in an area, that has consequences even in others, right? So we call them law because since the Treaty of Lisbon, the name is actually laws. Before they were pieces of legislation, etc. Now the name, it's just law, and especially in the case of regulation. So as you can see, the power of making those laws and the power to influence those laws can mean a lot. The possibility to speak to the institutions and influence these pieces of legislations makes a huge difference. So the decision-making process. Don't be scared. This is actually simpler than it looks. So the European Council writes a beautiful agenda for the next 5 years where they say these topics should be treated, right? Then that gives the European Commission the obligation to act on these topics. So let's say the European Council said, well, at some stage, we're going to have to write something about, let's say, social rights, right? Then the European Commission has the obligation now to create something, let's say, on working time. You can only work up to a certain amount of hours, let's say, right? Actually, let's choose something that is a little bit easier because it's a total competency. Let's say it's a law about, we need a law about pollution, right? Environment, of course, doesn't know borders, because you can't happily pollute in your country that without having heavy consequences on your neighbors. So that is a European competency. So let's say the European Council says, let's legislate on the amount of pollution you can have in the air, fine powders, let's call them that way. The European Commission then drafts a draft law on this topic. Then they send it directly. We say to the European Parliament, but the first person who receives that draft is the European Parliament rapporteur, right? This rapporteur belongs to the ENVI committee, the European Parliament Committee on the Environment, right? So this rapporteur, let's say, is from S&D. He had the chance of being given this topic. Let's say it's more likely to be Greens. So there's one rapporteur and he's from Greens, but there's going to be a shadow rapporteur from S&D, a shadow rapporteur from EPP, a shadow rapporteur from ECR, one shadow rapporteur from all political groupings, right? What do the shadows do? Basically, they coordinate each member of their party and their work on this topic. First of all, the fellow members of the committee, and then all the other members of the European Parliament who are in their groups. What does that mean? If I am a member of ENVI, but I'm not the shadow rapporteur, and I'm in S&D, I will write some amendments to these pieces of legislation. I will send them to my shadow rapporteur. My shadow rapporteur might tell me, listen, this amendment is the same as this other guy from our party has written. I will just merge them in two. Are you okay with that? And then we'll go forward. Or I'll be told, listen, we talked with the legal service of the European Parliament. Your amendment is actually not in line with previous laws, so we can't accept it. And I'm going to have to accept it because my shadow rapporteur in that case is my boss. And even more, if this might be said by the rapporteur itself, the rapporteur might say to the shadow, listen, this amendment you accepted here, actually you can't accept it. It's not in line with the rest of the other laws that we have and established. And the shadow will have to give it up to the EP rapporteur. You can imagine this rapporteur has quite a lot of power. And so the rapporteur then gathers a list of amendments. The rapporteur himself will have the possibility to work on the piece of legislation himself with other amendments and considerations. And then this piece of amendments will go to the committee in charge, to the ENVI committee. The ENVI committee will work on the amendments. They will vote on the amendments, and they will vote on the amendments. So this piece of legislation written by the Commission will be changed by the ENVI committee. And this piece, as changed by the committee, will then be transferred to the European Parliament plenary in Strasbourg. All right? In Strasbourg, they will vote on what the committee has done, but they will have the right to write their own amendments as well. So all the other people who are not members of the ENVI committee, all the other MEPs, will write their own amendments. And so this barrage of amendments will get to the rapporteur, who's going to have to organize the work there as well, merge the similar ones, reject those who are not admissible, etc. And then the plenary will be able to vote on the amended text and approve it or not. At the same time that all of this is happening, in the Council of Ministers of the Environmental Ministries, of course, they will look at the same text and they will make their own amendments. And they will make their own work on this, and then this work will have to go to the European Parliament too, and they will have to find an agreement on a common text. if they don't find an agreement on a common text, and this is an instance that is producing itself more and more, they will go to a moment which is called trialogue. So rather than having a back and forth of amendments between the Parliament and the Council, which is, 751 people on one side and 27 on the other, you will have a moment where, to represent the Parliament, there will only be the President of the European Parliament and the rapporteur, again, very important role. And on the other hand, you will have a representative from the Council and one from the Commission, because of course the Commission will be trying to defend their baby in some way. They drafted the law, so of course they were convinced that that law was quite well done as it was, so they will try to work on that. And from the agreement of this trialogue, finally, the law will be made and it will be implemented everywhere. So, who is acting for who? The European Commission, like every European commissioner, but a European Commission at every stage represents all the time the interests of all European citizens. There's no parties, no countries, no nothing, just a general interest of all European citizens. So in the case especially of the environment, the Commission obviously will shoot for the highest level of protection of the citizens, because of course that's what they have to do. But then the European Parliament will balance out the interest of many other things. Of course, the rapporteur from the Greens will probably be quite in agreement with the European Commission, but he will have colleagues in the Environmental Committee that probably will need to protect communities who live thanks to the work of coal mines, which are quite polluting, or industries, chemical industries, for example. In other, say that you have a region in Italy, say around Milan, that has a chemical industry that might be quite touched by this specific law, then of course the MEP there is not only thinking about the health of the lungs of the people who live around Milan, they will also be thinking about the jobs that will be lost. So these are very difficult interests to be balanced out. And the Council of the Ministries, of course, they will be thinking about something else entirely. Yes, the health of the lungs of their citizens in one side, but on the other side, they also will have to balance out as well those jobs lost eventually, etc., etc. So there's a lot of interest there coming over there. And it's really hard to make them all work. We had a meeting with an MEP thanks to the Roots for Reconciliation program, and earlier in December in 2019, and he said something very true. He said, if everybody is just a little bit unsatisfied, that means it's a good agreement, because it was a big compromise of everybody's interest. Unfortunately, when you just have so many, it's really hard to go maybe as far as you would like, but compromise and consensus is what the EU works on. So here you have, let's be the devil's advocate. You might have heard a lot of times, the EU is not democratic. What does democracy mean? This is the big question, but I won't bore you with something very, very philosophical. All of you will have the different opinions on that. So probably some of you might have asked yourself, is the EU democratic? Is it not? Or maybe some of you have never imagined it would have all these powers. So if you have maybe an idea, do you know maybe what is the percentage of people in your country that is happy with how the EU works and how the EU is? Maybe you can write in the comments, you can write to us. How is your country feeling about this institution? I'm gonna wait here a little, because it takes 10 seconds for everything to come to us. No opinion? Did I stun you into boredom? We're waiting, don't worry. It's not the end of the stream and my audio still works. We're just waiting for some of you to give us an idea of what are the feelings about the EU in their own countries. It can be also a non-EU country, actually. Probably some non-EU countries have quite important views about the EU as well. We discovered that too, having good chats. We had some chats where we had our young people to talk with MEPs, and we had a good window onto what young people and other countries think about the EU. So we see no question there and no answer. So what can we say? The fact that the EU is not democratic is a question and is an issue that many people raise. I would, the jury for many people is all out. I have my own opinions, of course, but I won't put them on you. The tip I have for you is always to ask yourself who elects who, which is mostly who controls who. That's a good way to look at a political entity and understands who has the power, basically. This is the big question. Okay, so we have Aikui from Armenia says Armenia is not a EU member, but simply cooperation works well, I guess, she says. Then Olga from Belarus says, I'm from Belarus, I can't comment. Okay, well, of course, there's different levels of democratic scrutiny in different countries, definitely. That doesn't stop anyone from having their own opinions about the EU, because honestly, as complex as it is, people's opinions will vary a lot. As I said, try to look who's got the power to change what and who has the power on who. It is true that people directly elect to the European Parliament. It's true. If you don't go to, if you're an EU member and you don't go to vote for the European Parliament, you're literally losing any power you might have to control the EU yourself. And I am quite strong on civic participation, and I'm just, many people died to give us the right to vote. So not going to vote for me is wrong, but you might have many reasons. You might say, I have no choice because the choices I have in front of me are no choices, they're horrible. However, the moment you choose not to vote, that's when your power really is taken away from you. And people also directly elect national governments inside the EU. And so as people, you elect your government, you elect the EP, so you have that control. Then the national government you have elected becomes the council. So it's a part, so you have power on already two parts of the decision-making process, the parliament and the council. You elect your government, so the council represents you in that sense. You elect the parliament represents you in that sense. Then the national government also proposes commissioners. So the national government you voted for has brought forward Ursula von der Leyen, let's say, or this or this other person. And then the European Parliament that you elected, again, also has the power to approve or reject commissioners. So, if they have approved someone you didn't like, you're totally free to, give a phone call. And don't laugh about it. Many countries have that tradition of, calling their MEPs and criticizing them or asking them to do something. And that's part of their job. They need to answer that phone, that email, and, they're actually quite happy to be contacted, because most MEPs are just not contacted by their constituency. And so you'd be surprised. If you contact them, you might find way more an open space than you have imagined. So who decides in the EU? Who has that power? The Council of the EU, the European Council, or even before, makes the agenda. Then the Council also has that power through the presidency. Then the Commission proposes the laws that derive from that agenda. So it's not like the Commission decides out of the blue what to write. They can't write something that is not on the agenda, that is made by the Council, which is your national government. And then the Parliament and the councils that you vote for amend and approve. So the issue there, I could simplistically say, then you can totally control it. But that's not true, because then depends if you vote. It also depends on how the people in your countries bring forward candidates for the European Parliament, and how maybe corrupted is that or that party or that system. Of course, it all depends. But as it is built, it does try to give the power that it should have. However, the thing that is very different from national governments is, in our case, it's our national parliament that proposes law. That is different, of course. But the jury is out there, and if you have an opinion about the EU and its democratic value, please shoot it down here in the comments. I will read it, and so everyone might be able to chip in and talk about that. So finally, we've talked about the EU so much. Let's talk about the Council of Europe, which most likely, if you all come from the European continent, all of you are listening, represents all of you. Hands down, mostly everyone on the continent is represented. So the main themes of the Council of Europe works for are human rights, democracy, the rule of law. So they write recommendations mostly, and they work on those topics by trying to improve and increase and monitor how democratic values, human rights, and the rule of law are implemented in each of their own countries. If they see something is going in a certain direction, they try to recommend to change it, etc. It's a quite important work they do, and they still are our watchdogs, let's say, in keeping an eye on what should be the founding values for the European countries which are member of the Council of Europe. Different countries have different rules of who to send to the Council of Europe, but mostly country delegations are quite fairly wide, but not as big as you might think. So why is that important for us, the Council of Europe? Of course, about human rights and democracy, because as a youth NGO, these are part of our values too, and these are part of the enjoyment of human rights is what we look after in our communities. We try to make sure that the people we care about can enjoy their rights fully. But also the Council of Europe has a quite important youth department. This youth department gives a specific look onto youth work, which is so important. It's not something that is done by many international organizations, but this really does, because they recognize that it's through youth work oftentimes that new generations are formed, and that human rights, democracy, and the rule of law are values that are nurtured. And it's not necessarily in schools sometimes, it's often in our youth organizations. Thank God someone recognizes that. And so this is what they look at. They have, for this reason, what they call an advisory council on youth, which is a body that works in a system of co-management, a partnership between youth organizations and governments. So the ministries that are interested on the topic of youth, members of the Council of Europe, and representatives from youth organizations from countries all over Europe, they sit together on the co-management team, and together they establish standards and work priorities for the youth sector of the Council of Europe, and they give recommendations for future priorities, programs, and budgets. Among other things, this advisory council has written recommendations on youth work quality, on respect of human rights, on enjoyment of rights from young people, the protection of young migrants, the protection of the internally displaced people, the end of discrimination on the basis of race, gender, etc. Many things that we all care about. These recommendations, of course, they don't have the same power, let's say, of the law that the law has in the EU, for example. But the system is an intense system of cooperation between ministries, and to be involved in the Council of Europe means that you keep that table open. Now, it doesn't seem that strong compared to giving a fine in front of a court, but oftentimes keeping the channel of conversation open is the first step to change and to really keep a country in a circle, in a community of people that can, maybe make a difficult situation a little bit easier. So the the Advisory Council on Youth is quite important because it also establishes some funding for youth. So if we go back a bit of the EU, the funding for youth of the EU is given by the Erasmus Plus program. Of course, there's other pieces of programs that deal with youth, but the main one is Erasmus Plus. It supports education, training, and youth and sports in Europe. We have talked about it the other day. It's a quite intense system where you also have involved countries that are not members of the EU. Let's remember that. For the Council of Europe, though, you have the European Youth Foundation. Hands down, this is some of the most youth-friendly funding in Europe. The European Youth Foundation deeply understands youth work and how we think and how we work. And it's a really true important partner. for YMCA Europe, but for many other, for all of our members that have worked with them. So how do we get to influence the work of the European Union and the Council of Europe? These two very, very important entities that make laws that influence our lives. The European Youth Forum is the biggest platform that we have as youth organizations to act on both fronts. So the European Youth Forum has approximately 140 members, and it's the biggest youth platform in Europe. The members of this is because if you are a youth organization, oftentimes you are either a member of a national youth council or you are a member of an international youth NGO. So if you are a YMCA in one of your countries, say you are YMCA Germany, you're a member of the German National Youth Council and you're a member of YMCA Europe. Thus, you are represented 2 times in the European Youth Forum. The European Youth Forum has a board, which is elected volunteers, like our boards, no, not different than that, and a secretariat, so some staff. Their main job is youth advocacy. So we sit in the European Youth Forum twice a year in the Council of Members, and we give them direction on what to ask European institutions such as the EU and the Council of Europe. So for example, the European Youth Forum might decide to work on labor rights for young people, or rights for young migrants, or for example, quality of youth work. We as members get the chance to write that document with them and amend it. And on the basis of that policy paper, let's say that they will create, say on youth work or funding for youth work, they will address European institutions and they will push and advocate and lobby for youth with European institutions, the EU and the Council of Europe. So where are we? This is a bit of more of a visual idea on how YMCA Europe, sorry, it's a good thing that I forgot to say, YMCA Europe is among the founding members of the European Youth Forum. So where are we here? Say that you are a small youth organization. You see that white dot on the bottom left here? You're a small youth organization, a small YMCA. You're a local YMCA. So you most likely are a member of a local youth council, so a platform that connects all youth organizations in that city maybe. And maybe that local youth council is also a member of the National Youth Council. And you as a local YMCA, you're a member of your national YMCA, and that national YMCA is a member of the National Youth Council. And your national YMCA is a member of YMCA Europe, and your National Youth Council is a member of the European Youth Forum, and YMCA Europe is a member of the European Youth Forum. So look at how many times you are represented inside the European Youth Forum. Then the European Youth Forum, of course, addresses the Council of Europe and the European Union. And so as you can see, there's plenty of opportunities for us to state what we believe in and what we want from European institutions. So how do we do this advocacy and youth policy? As we said, we put input into the European Youth Forum documents. You see, we call it YFJ. This is because it's a weird way of naming the European Youth Forum that implements the 2 main working languages, which are English and French. So Forum Jeunesse is FJ there. So youth is the first, so it's a bit weird, but there you go. That's how they make it. So the European Youth Forum works on policy documents, and to write these policy documents, first of all, it gathers what they call expert groups. So for example, there's a small group of members of the European Youth Forum. For example, YMCA Europe is a member of the group on funding for youth organizations. So let's say we draft a policy paper on what we want from the next Erasmus Plus program, what we want from the next budget of the European Union. And then this document goes to the council of all the members. They can amend the document, and then the final document gets approved by the European Youth Forum members. And on the basis of this document, the European Youth Forum will know we want 3 times the amount of funding for youth organizations. We want the language to be easier so that our local youth organizations can apply for funding. We want, we want that youth funding is not only under Erasmus Plus, but it is easier for youth organizations to get funding to work with migrants or with vulnerable groups, etc., etc. And then the European Youth Forum also does direct consultations with us. So for the members of YMCA Europe, you know that earlier in the year, I sent around a piece of consultation on civic participation. The European Youth Forum wanted to know what we want in terms of youth participation and what we do. And so in that case, I sent forward as YMCA Europe to our members the questions, then they answer, then I merge those answers and I send them off to the to the European Youth Forum, who puts them into a policy paper. What the European Youth Forum does is a direct dialogue with European institutions. So we get to participate to quite important meetings. For example, we, with a group of other 8 fellow youth NGOs, the biggest ones in Europe, because we are one of the biggest ones, we got to talk with the rapporteurs on the new budget of the EU a couple of years ago. And we got to influence it because specifically we asked for youth mainstreaming, that's how I called it, for all European programs, meaning that there should be set aside youth-friendly budgeting in every program, not only on Erasmus Plus, and that actually appeared in the proposal for the budget. And then we also have the chance to bring our young people to talk directly to institutions. Specifically, the European Commission wanted to consult us on the EU youth strategy, so we sent our youth representatives, our young leaders, to brainstorm with the European Commission what the next EU youth strategy should look like. And it shows, because some of the things we have proposed and our youth representatives have proposed are in there now. So we were consulted directly on the EU youth strategy. We participated to what we call the Erasmus per 10 campaign. We asked for 10 times the amount of budget because, as we say in Italy, if you don't shoot, if you shoot to the ground, it's quite difficult. You reach the stars. If you shoot for the stars, probably you can get something a little bit above ground. And so we got a proposal for a per tree. Still, works are a little bit, we haven't had a final word on that, but we hope to see that approved. And the European Solidarity Corps, for those who listened to the other presentation, for example, at the start, they decided that this new program would be close to partner countries, so non-EU countries, and we heavily lobbied to avoid that because, of course, that would have been a huge injustice that non-EU countries would be excluded, and thank God we had a proposal that went in that direction. So how do we do that? YMCA Europe has what we call a youth policy group. It's what we call a youth-led advocacy. So we send out calls periodically to our members to send us young people that are interested in talking to European institutions, that are interested in writing policy papers to define YMCA Europe's opinion on certain issues, and that are able to amend those documents that the European Youth Forum sends over, and also are able to represent us to talk to European institutions directly. So at this very moment, we sent out a call and we're in a moment of rechange. We had an average of around 9 members from different countries. And to be honest, we're trying to expand it as much as possible. So why do I say it's a youth-led advocacy? I don't write policy papers. I simply try to coordinate the work from the Brussels office. We work on advocacy this way. And we have these meetings with the youth policy group. We define main questions to define the main problem and the main way to solve it, and then they write their contributions and I simply merge it, and then our executive committee amends and comments on that and approves it. This is our way to give a democratic legitimacy to it, since the executive committee is elected by YMCA Europe members. This is our way of doing it. Many other youth or fellow youth organizations do it differently. So, for example, a fellow organization in the European Youth Forum, WASM, the Scout group, they have their own way of working on their policy papers, etc. This is our way, and we try to do it in the most youth-friendly and democratic way possible. So if you are a YMCA Europe member listening now, we had our call expiring 2 days ago for the youth policy group, but if you're listening and you're thinking about having some of your young people under 30 joining, there's still some time. We won't look badly at a 1-week delay on the deadline, and have a look at the call that is published on our website and see if you want to join us. Always open for sure. So we have policy papers, as we said. We have a strategy that is expiring now on migration, peace and justice, youth employment, and youth empowerment. They were the 4 themes of our former strategy, and this is where we wrote our policy papers. You can see them on our website. It's the hard work of our youth policy group people, their sweat and blood, because it's been long work, and they've done a really great job, I think, in trying to represent fairly what our members think. They consult with their YMCAs, so we have an input from our members on that too, and we often send off these to experts. So in the case of the peace and justice policy paper, it was heavily influenced and drafted as well with the Roots for Reconciliation program, which is our peace building program, because they are our in-house expert on peace and justice, and it was absolutely necessary that they had a huge influence on this policy paper. So I have a question for you. If you're not dead now already from all this barrage of information that I have put on you, may I ask you if you know the difference, if you can give me in 2 words, the difference between what's the European Council, what's the Council of the EU, what's the Council of Europe? What's the difference? Can you shoot us something? I'll read the comments. Don't mind the little dog, he's not laughing at you, I swear. Let's hope that you're still alive. So can you give me in 1 word, who's my member of the European Council? Who sits on the European Council? Dun, 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 dun. I'm starting to hear Sergio Leone's music. Don't you worry if you can't remember straight away right now, because it takes time. I can tell you that. If you don't remember about the European Council, you can write about the other ones if you remember them. Ah, well, I have absolutely scared you off. That's no problem. Maybe you're supposed to be scared. I'm joking. You're not. But you might have questions, because I'm not taking for granted I was clear enough, or that you got everything I said. So this is the moment where, if you have any question whatsoever about the EU that you've always wanted to ask, please shoot it here. And no, I don't know much about the drinking habits of the former president of the European Commission. Juncker was a lovely guy. I can say that. When we met him a couple of times. Any question about the EU? Anything that you're really dying to ask? About our work with them? Anything. Or about the Council of Europe. But I will admit, I know more about the EU. So maybe Haikui can tell us more about the Council of Europe, actually. Sorry for putting you on the spot. See, it's really terrible having to do this via video, because if we were face to face, we could do some of those amazing non-formal education things. Oh, Echo, there you go, a question. Jonathan Van Varik, European Council, heads of state, Council of the EU, ministers on separate fields of policy, Council of Europe, separate institution. Perfect. There you go. That's a dream come true for a trainer. It happened right in front of my eyes. Yes, exactly. So let's go to our question. The European Council is where heads of states sit, and they give input for big changes, big treaty changes, etc. The Council of the EU, there's ministries on separate fields of policy, exactly, Council with Agriculture, etc., or environment. And the Council of Europe is a completely separate institution. The EU, 27 members, the Council of Europe has 47. It helps me to remembering the two different memberships. 27 on one side, EU, Council of Europe, 47. So keep it in mind. Wonderful. So as I said, if you guys have any question whatsoever, shoot them easily and happily here. And if you have any questions about how we work with institutions, about our advocacy, if you want to participate, and you can definitely shoot us an email. I always forget to put my email. That is really bad manners, but I will put it in here again. And of course, we are okay. Okay, Haikui one says, no problem, I can try. That would be lovely. If we were face to face, it would absolutely be fantastic to have a more of a longer session, because I'm afraid that I'm running out of time now. But we should definitely have something more on the Council of Europe. So as I was saying, for any question or if you want to work with us, you can contact the Brussels office at my email over there, and we will upload the recording of this webinar to hear my annoying voice once again. And you can have the slides with all that information that definitely has crowded your mind and given you some terrors until now, but it's there written, so if you can come back to it and have a little bit more about it. And there's information more on our website about the Youth Policy Group if you want to know more about it. And I can redirect you to other sources about the EU and the Parliament, etc., and the Council of Europe, etc. So yeah, thank you so much for staying with us and for staying alive during it, because it was tough, I can understand. It's a bit of a heavy subject. So thank you so much, and I hope to chat to you again. Bye.